Welcome to another quiet journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we invite you to let go of the present and sink gently into a different time, to a world where the walls were lined not with paintings or paper, but with salt, and the days were measured in weight, sweat, and slow, echoing footsteps deep underground. As you settle into the calm of your surroundings, you'll be traveling back to the underworld of the Ancien, the early modern salt mines of France. Long before the world came to know the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it was bound together by different laws, different struggles, and different forms of quiet misery. This was a time when salt was more than a seasoning. It was necessity, currency, and control. Beneath the surface of France, men descended into tunnels, not for glory or gold, but to scrape mineral wealth from the belly of the earth, bit by painful bit so it could be measured, taxed, and sent to royal tables far, far away. In tonight's journey, we will begin by waking in the dim hours before dawn in the life of a common French salt miner. We will follow his footsteps into the dark tunnels. We will feel the weight of the loads he bore, hear the cough that never left him, and explore the world of salt from the ground beneath to the halls of gilded privilege. You will come to understand why salt, of all things, could spark riots, why it inspired fear and fury, and why it eventually helped bring down a monarchy. So imagine yourself now, somewhere in the center of France, perhaps near Salins-les-Bains or Douze. It is the 1780s. The year is uncertain, but the work, as always, begins before the sun rises. Breathe slowly as we descend into the first part of our story, the cold and clinging misery of the salt miner's morning. The hour is too early to be called morning. It is the long moment just before dawn, when the world still belongs to the dark. There is no birdsong, no whisper of light on the horizon, only the creak of wood and the occasional thud of footsteps on packed dirt. In a small, wind-worn cottage near the edge of the mining quarter, you stir in your bed of straw and coarse linen, pulled from shallow sleep by the cold that never really left the room during the night. You are not well rested. You rarely are. The air inside your room is thick with dampness. Your breath forms a faint mist as you sit up slowly, pushing aside the tattered woolen blanket that clings to your shoulders. Beneath your feet, the floor is cold, uneven, and splintered from years of wear. You do not rush. There is no sense in hurrying. The work will begin soon enough, and the mines do not care how quickly you reach them. Outside, the wind groans low across the empty hills, stirring the frost that clings to bare branches and broken shutters. It is late autumn, or perhaps early winter. It is hard to say exactly. The seasons blur underground. You know only that the mornings have grown colder and that the daylight, what little of it you see, fades faster each week. Some of the older miners say they can feel the seasons changing in their bones, that the salt dampens their flesh like slow-moving ice. You are beginning to understand what they mean. Your clothing is simple and worn, a patchwork of previous garments, a coarse linen shirt, yellowed with sweat and age, trousers that have been mended more times than you can remember, a short woolen coat, stiff at the elbows, its edges caked with traces of salt that never wash out. You pull on your boots last. They are heavy and slick with yesterday's work, still wet as they always are, with a cold that sinks into your toes like melted stone. The salt preserves nothing but pain. The leather cracks, the soles are soft in places, and the lining is long since gone. And yet, they are yours. You have no others. You step outside and draw in a breath of sharp, sulfur-tinged air. The mine lies just beyond the bend in the valley, where a half-collapsed fence leans toward the edge of the forest. Smoke curls from a few neighboring chimneys, though it smells more of burning straw than wood. Wood is scarce. Most of it goes to the mine, used to reinforce tunnels or fuel the evaporation pans. There is little left for warmth. The other miners are beginning to appear, no figures, moving slowly in the gray light, heads low, scarves drawn tight across chapped faces. No one speaks. There is nothing to say that has not been said before. The rhythm of this life has dulled even conversation. Each step toward the mine is taken without thought, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. A communal pot near the entrance to the barracks offers a thin broth for those who can stomach it. A few scraps of cabbage, the occasional sliver of potato. Salted pork is rare and reserved for feast days, or more often, for the overseers. You tear off a piece of black bread, hard as stone at the edges, and chew slowly. It does not soften. Still, it fills your stomach enough to keep the ache at bay. The foreman's whistle sounds sharp against the morning quiet, a long, shrill note that echoes off the wooden structures and carries down into the stone. It is time. The mouth of the mine looms ahead. It is not a singular, dramatic hole in the earth, but a sprawling series of entries and descensum carved centuries ago. Others recently reinforced with new timbers that already bear the stains of time. The entrance nearest you is low and braced with dark beams slick from groundwater. A small lantern flickers just inside, casting uneven shadows across the salt-slicked floor. You step inside. Immediately, the air changes. It grows denser, cooler, and more alive in a way that has nothing to do with wind or warmth. It presses in from all sides, as though the earth is breathing slowly around you. The sounds change, too. Outside, the world had the dull hum of frost and footsteps. Down here, sound travels differently. It echoes where it should not, vanishes when you expect it to carry. The silence is rarely full. It hums with unseen movement, the groan of ancient wood, the drip of mineral water, the occasional fall of loose salt in the distance. The tunnels are never still. Your hands brush the walls as you descend, feeling the rough crystals embedded in the stone. The salt is not pure white, not like the kind used in royal kitchens. It is gray, sometimes yellowish, laced with the colors of clay and ancient sediment. It grinds against your skin like sand, and after enough days, years, it begins to carve itself into your fingers. The older men have hands, like stone-cracked, gnarled, hard to the touch. You are still younger, but the change has begun. Salt finds its way into every wound, every scrape, every nail bed. The sores never heal entirely. They fade and return with the rhythm of the work. The descent continues. The ladders are crude and slick. Ropes hang where rails should be. Your boots slip sometimes. Everyone's do. You learn quickly how to fall in a way that does not break bones. Or, if you are unlucky, you do not learn at all. At last, you reach your level. It is narrow, here barely high enough to stand upright. The ceiling dips unevenly, and the beams groan with each shift of weight above. A few small lanterns offer weak pools of light, their flames dancing in the drafts. You choose a spot and begin to work. You carry a pickaxe fashioned for the task, not large, but heavy, with a short handle and a wedge-shaped blade worn smooth from use. Your task is to loosen the salt from the walls without collapsing the chamber. It is slow work and dangerous. Each strike sends vibrations through the tunnel. Each clump of dislodged salt must be inspected for quality and collected into baskets or wooden carts for hauling. The salt shatters in irregular chunks. Some pieces come away easily. Others cling stubbornly, as if the earth has decided to resist your intrusion. Occasionally, you find markings in the salt-told symbols, initials carved by men who came before you. Some are no longer alive. Some simply moved on, though no one seems to know where to. Those who leave rarely return. Your shirt is soaked through by morning, not with sweat though. There is plenty of that, but with the dampness of the mine itself. Water seeps through the walls constantly. It drips onto your shoulders, onto your neck, into your sleeves. You do not even flinch anymore. The cold is constant. You breathe it in with every gasp. The salt in the air dries your mouth, scratches your throat, irritates your lungs. That cough, the one you heard this morning, it is back now. Deep, dry, persistent. You barely notice it. Everyone coughs. The dust never truly settles. Your meal break comes late. A few minutes to lean against the wall and chew another piece of bread, perhaps a slice of onion if you brought one. There is no fire, no warm place to sit, just a pause in the darkness. A moment to adjust your grip, stretch your fingers, breathe deeply through your scarf. Then the work resumes. By early evening, the carts are full. You and 2 others haul them to the surface, a process as slow and painful as anything below. The shafts are steep, and the weight is unforgiving. Your legs tremble with each step. The ropes bite into your palms, and still the overseers say nothing unless you stop. Then their voices are sharp, quick, icy, not cruel exactly, just cold, like the mine. When you finally emerge, the light outside has changed. The sun is low, stretching across the hills like melted gold, but you hardly see it. Your eyes are still adjusting. Your mind is elsewhere. The walk home is slower than the walk in. You are heavier now in body and spirit. Your boots squelch with each step. The salt dries into flakes around your cuffs. Your joints ache, and yet tomorrow you will return. In the quiet of your hut, you undress with care. The salt has left rashes on your thighs, your elbows. You rub them gently with lard or tallow, if you have any. If not, you simply wait for the pain to dull. The fire is low. You curl beneath your blanket. Your chest tightens when you lie flat. The cough returns once more, and then, in time, you sleep. It is not restful, but it is escape, and in just a few hours, it will all begin again. The days in the mine do not begin or end so much as stretch long and indistinct across a horizon of gray, mineral-coated sameness. You may try to measure time by the number of lanterns you relight, the weight of the baskets you carry, or the number of times you feel your shoulders buckle under their load. But soon enough, even those markers blur, melting into one another like dripping salt water. There is no real clock down here, only the rhythm of labor, a rhythm that pulses with the sound of pickaxes striking stone, of wood groaning under strain, of breath drawn short against the dust-heavy air. You learn quickly that the mine is not just a place you enter. It is a world that surrounds you, completely a geography unto itself. Above ground, seasons may shift, and stars may wheel overhead, but beneath the surface there is only the slow and grinding permanence of the tunnels. A low ceiling lined with damp beams, walls that sparkle faintly, not from beauty, but from sweat and salt. Floors that suck at your boots and threaten to swallow every careless step. Your tasks vary, but none offer relief. Some days you're placed with the cutters, hacking into the seams of salt with dull-edged picks, your arms swinging in an exhausting cadence, muscles knotting with effort. The salt resists. It is not the clean, soft kind you might imagine, dissolving on your tongue. It is stubborn. Some sections are dense and brittle, like fossilized snow. Others are gummy and refuse to part with their minerals, clinging as though reluctant to serve another master. Your fingers bleed sometimes, though you say nothing. Everyone's hands are raw. It is part of the job. Other days, you haul. You crouch beside a narrow cartonneau, larger than a coffin hand. Fill it with the results of another man's labor, basket after basket, shovel after shovel. When the cart is full, you and one or two others drag it by rope through uneven tunnels. The wheels catch often. The floor is not smooth, and small stones or clumps of salt block the way. Your knees ache from bracing. Your spine protests with every bend. But the cart must move. The foreman walks the tunnels in unpredictable intervals, his footsteps muffled but unmistakable, and his voice is sharper than the edges of your tools. Everywhere in the mine there is noise, but it is not loud in the way the surface world can be. It is more like a dull background hum, picks chipping against rock, ropes creaking under strain, distant calls from other miners that echo off the walls and return to you like ghostly murmurs. Occasionally, there is a silence that falls, unusual, sudden, and heavy. That silence is not comforting, it is a warning. Something may have shifted. A support beam may be failing. A section may have collapsed elsewhere, or someone may have stopped moving. Collapses are feared above all else. The mine is old, centuries old, in some parts, and its supports, though reinforced and replaced, are never entirely trustworthy. Water eats at the wood, pressure warps the beams, salt shifts over time, just slowly enough to lull you into forgetting its danger. But the earth remembers, and when the ceiling comes down, it does so without mercy. There is no time to run, and often no room. Sometimes a man is buried and dug out hours later. Sometimes all that is recovered is his pickaxe and a battered boot. You learn to read the mine like a living thing. You notice the faint moan of stress in the beams, the tremor in the wall that wasn't there yesterday, the slight scent change in the air when deeper sections begin to shift. Some say you can smell the collapse before it comes, not in the way of smoke or rot, but a subtle change, something wetter, something more metallic. No one can explain it, but when you smell it, you grow quiet. You move more carefully. You begin to pray. It is during the hauling that your cough returns in earnest. The dust kicked up by the movement of salt fills your lungs and settles deep in your chest. The salt doesn't just coat your skin, it infiltrates. The deeper into the mine you go, the harder it becomes to breathe. You try to wrap a cloth around your face, but it becomes damp quickly and then offers little protection. By your second year, your cough is constant. By your fourth, you hear it in your sleep. Some of the older miners cannot climb the ladders anymore. Their knees are stiffened by years of strain, their backs bowed from the unrelenting loads. These men are reassigned to lighter tasks, measuring and sorting, repairing carts, sharpening tools. They are no less tired, simply slower, more worn. Their faces are carved with years of quiet endurance. Their stories are few, and mostly told in glances and gestures. They have seen friends buried, seen the tunnels flood and dry and collapse again. They do not speak of it, they only work. The air deep in the mine is always cool, always damp. It sticks to your skin and your thoughts. There is a strange comfort in the constancy of it, even as it wears you down. You begin to forget the feel of wind, the warmth of direct sun on your face, the smell of fresh grass. Down here, everything smells faintly of brine and wet stone, even your clothes, even your own breath. And yet, there is a rhythm to this life. Not peace, exactly, but predictability. You know what each day will bring. You know how long it takes to move a cart from one chamber to the next. You know when the lantern needs more oil. You know the exact sound your pick makes when it strikes good, solid salt. These things root you. They carry you through the hours. The miners speak little during the day. The work is too loud for soft voices, too repetitive for stories. But there are glances shared, small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod, a helping hand when a cart sticks, a piece of bread quietly passed from one hand to another. In these moments, you are reminded that you are not alone, that others endure this with you. Meal breaks are short and taken in silence. The food is never warm, never enough. Bread, onions, perhaps a salted fish if you're lucky. Water from a shared jug. You eat with your back against the wall, watching the lantern light flicker on the ceiling above. Sometimes, a man will close his eyes for a minute, let his head rest back, but never for long. The mine doesn't allow for rest. The work resumes quickly and always without complaint. As the day stretches toward its end, your limbs feel heavier. The salt has caked onto your skin, dried into your hair, filled your socks with abrasive grit. You long for the surface, though the climb will test your last reserves of strength. The tunnels begin to feel tighter. The air feels thinner. You push the final carts forward, your body aching with each step. The path to the exit feels longer today. It always does. Finally, you emerge. The daylight is thin, almost gone. The sky is streaked with soft blue and gray, and the cold wind that greets you is sharp but welcome. You blink against the brightness, your eyes adjusting slowly. The surface world seems too wide, too open. After the tunnels, even the sky can feel overwhelming. You trudge home in silence, boots leaving heavy prints in the dirt. Your back is bent. Your hands shake slightly from the constant strain. But you made it. Another day complete. At home, you remove your coat, peel off your damp shirt, and sit by the fire. You do not speak. You simply breathe. The warmth is shallow, but it soothes the edge of your exhaustion. You eat a bit more soup, perhaps, or stew if you've managed to trade with a neighbor. Then you lie down. Your body throbs in places you can't name. The cough comes again. And sleep, when it arrives, feels less like rest and more like retreat. And tomorrow, the day will stretch again, and the salt will wait for you. The salt you mined by lamplight and carried on your back did not belong to you. It was never yours, not even a single grain. This was a fact etched into the daily rhythm of your life, unchanging, unquestioned, but deeply resented. Though it was your hands that bled against the stone, your lungs that rasped from the dust, the salt was property of the crown. The same salt that stung your wounds and coated your clothes with crusted white would soon grace royal platters, be stored in state warehouses, and perhaps most bitterly be sold back to the very people who helped drag it from the earth. This was the Gabelle, deeply unpopular, widely hated, and profoundly unjust salt tax of pre-revolutionary France. For centuries, it defined not only the economy, but the social fabric, deepening the lines between rich and poor, province and province, worker and overseer. More than a tax, it was a weight on the soul of the nation, a quiet, grinding pressure that built and built year after year. And like all things that are pressed too tightly for too long, it would eventually break. To understand the anger it sparked, you must first understand how the Gabelle worked, not just as policy, but as lived experience. Unlike most taxes, the Gabelle wasn't simply a surcharge or a percentage, it was a mandatory purchase. In most regions of France, every person over the age of 8 was legally required to buy a fixed amount of salt each year from a royal depot, whether they needed it or not. The rates varied wildly across the kingdom. Some areas paid a modest price. Others, especially the southern and central provinces, paid up to 40 times more. This disparity, this flagrant inequality, was not merely resented. It was felt in every kitchen, in every preserved food jar, in every aching joint of those who labored to extract the salt itself. Worse still, the salt from different regions was not interchangeable. You could not, for example, buy cheaper salt in Brittany and carry it home to Languedoc. Transporting salt across provincial lines, la façonnage, was strictly illegal. Punishments ranged from heavy fines to imprisonment, and in some cases, labor sentences aboard galleys. Yes, for smuggling salt. And yet, people smuggled, in growing numbers, by footpaths through woods, hidden in saddlebags, disguised in barrels, marked for soap or wine. They called them fauconniers, salt smugglers, and they became folk heroes in some regions. Not brigands or robbers, but men and women resisting a cruelty that was both absurd and inescapable. This resistance did not stay quiet forever. By the mid-1700s, unrest was already simmering. The salt tax had been in place for centuries, but population growth, inflation, and rising food insecurity had made its effects sharper than ever. In some areas, the annual salt requirement cost families up to 1/5 of their income. Meanwhile, nobles and clergy were often exempt or granted favorable rates. Even some salt officers, less gabelous, grew fat off bribes and skimming. Imagine yourself now, not in the mine, but in a crowded village square. The air is thick with the smell of horse sweat and tallow smoke. Merchants hawk dried beans and old cloth, but attention cuts through the bustle. A man has been arrested for possessing salt without a receipt, perhaps purchased from a traveling peddler, or perhaps passed down from a relative. It doesn't matter. The law is clear. Salt outside the official channels is contraband. The crowd watches as he is led away, shackled. A few mutter curses, a few spit, but for now they remain still. In Provence, Languedoc, and the Auvergne, that stillness would not last. The Gabelle riots did not begin as grand, revolutionary gestures. They began with broken doors and seized warehouses, with angry peasants overturning salt carts, setting fire to storehouses, and driving tax collectors out of town with sticks and stones. In small hamlets and hillside villages, groups assembled in the dark, armed with sickles and farm tools, their faces wrapped in scarves. Their targets were not kings, not yet, but taxmen, salt officials, and the greenier Assel, the grim stone buildings where the hated salt was stored. In some places, the protests were short. A warehouse emptied, a few officials chased off, and calm restored. But in others, the fire burned hotter. Rebels tore down salt toll gates and blockades. Roads were seized. In the town of Issoire in Auvergne, the salt store was stormed, and the entire inventory was thrown into the street, trampled, scattered, reclaimed. Women played a crucial role in these actions. They carried baskets, threw stones, urged others forward with shouted slogans. Salt touched every part of domestic life. They felt its absence, its burden, and its insult as deeply as anyone. The government responded harshly. Royal soldiers were dispatched to suppress the riots, and in many cases succeeded. Dozens of arrests followed. Some were hanged. Others were sent to labor camps or naval galleys. Still others disappeared into provincial jails, their names forgotten. But each time the flame was stamped out, embers remained. The protests had revealed something irreversible, that the people no longer accepted the rules of the game, that attacks could be resisted, that a long, slow injustice could, under the right conditions, explode. As the century wore on, the gable became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy: its greed, its disconnection, its cruelty wrapped in bureaucracy. Even among the educated classes, disdain for the tax grew. Philosophes, pamphleteers, and reformers pointed to the absurdity of a system that criminalized families for seasoning their food. And then, in 1789, the flood came. By the time the French Revolution erupted in earnest, the Gabelle was not merely an inconvenience set, was a rallying cry. In the cahiers de the grievance lists submitted by towns and provinces ahead of the Estates General, the salt tax appeared again and again. In city after city, villagers and tradesmen demanded its abolition. Down with the gabelle, they wrote. Justice for the salt smugglers. Liberty for those who feed the kingdom. And in August of that year, amid the collapse of royal authority and the storming of the Bastille, the National Assembly declared the gabelle suspended. The salt workers heard the news in silence. There was no celebration in the tunnels, no wine spilled in joy. The work continued. The tunnels remained dark, the loads remained heavy, but beneath that silence, something shifted. A chain had broken. A burden had lifted, if only in law, if not yet in life. Still, not everyone would live to see the change. For some miners, and many smugglers, the revolution came too late. They had already paid the price. In brine, in labor, in prison, or in quiet, aching exile. Yet their struggle had left its mark. Salt, so small and pale and easily overlooked, had carried the fire of rebellion on its back, and the gable, once an unmovable pillar of the Ancien, lay crumbling in its wake. Long after the smoke of riots had cleared, and the gates of salt warehouses had been broken and repaired, something deeper had changed in France, something that would not be undone. It was not just that the gabelle had become unpopular, or that protests had made their mark. It was that the people, those long pressed under the weight of silence and salt alike, had begun to see their suffering as something more than personal. They began to recognize it as systemic, shared, inflicted, and they began to see that they were not alone. In the countryside, the memories of salt riots lingered not as isolated eruptions of rage, but as small flames in a field of dry straw. Talk spread not only of injustice, but of possibility. If one law, one ancient burdensome law, could be resisted, could be questioned, then perhaps others could be too. Perhaps the world need not remain fixed in place, stratified, top-down, and cruel. The gabelle had been a thread woven tightly into the fabric of daily life, and once that thread was pulled, others began to loosen with it. You can imagine the shift if you return once again to a modest home in rural France. Around the year 1790, the monarchy still exists, for now, but the air has changed. Families sit together by the hearth, not just to rest, but to talk, to whisper, to speculate. In homes where once obedience was all that could be offered, now questions are taking shape. Why should a man be jailed for boiling seawater to make salt? Why must a widow still pay for salt she cannot use? Why are some provinces privileged while others suffer? Why, above all, must the poor obey laws written to preserve the comfort of those far removed from hardship? These were not theoretical musings. These were the building blocks of revolution. The Gabelle was more than just a tax. It was a symbol, a small white crystal that crystallized inequality. It was the visible face of a system that turned survival into a crime, that made necessity into obligation, and obligation into debt. The fact that it was about salts, something simple, tangible, and needed, gave it more power than any abstract political theory ever could. And the resentment it sparked ran deep. In the towns, conversations began to spill into the open. Coffee houses and market stalls became spaces of debate. Printers published cheap pamphlets that condemned the salt tax in bold, bitter prose. The language was simple, direct. Salt had become the people's burden, and they would bear it no longer. And in the countryside, another kind of awareness grew quieter, perhaps, but no less potent. The salt miners, long seen as mere laborers, began to be understood as martyrs of a broken system. They had borne the physical cost of the Gabelle, descended into the earth day after day to extract wealth they would never enjoy. Their suffering became part of the national story, not just as an economic fact, but as an emotional touchstone. The salt miner was not just a figure of toil, but of injustice. His boots forever wet, his back forever bent, his body spent for a system that gave nothing in return. In the revolutionary imagination, salt became a kind of quiet heroism, an emblem of everything endured by the working poor, and everything demanded by a state too blind to see its own excess. The collapse of the Gabelle system was not a sudden event. Even after its official suspension in 1789, the structures around it lingered. Depots still stood, tax records still held, and local officials still hesitated to let go of long-held power. But the culture had shifted. Where once salt smugglers were seen as criminals, they were now remembered as rebels. Where once taxmen had been feared, they were now distrusted, mocked. Even the emotional tide had turned, and in the halls of government, the echoes of the salt riots reached all the way to Paris. The National Assembly debated not only the Gabelle's repeal, but the larger question of how France should be governed at all. Salt, in its way, had opened the door to broader conversations about taxation, privilege, and the rights of citizens. The structure of the Ancien, its rigid hierarchies, its uneven laws, its deeply embedded class divisions, began to look less like tradition and more like tyranny. As the revolution accelerated, the Gabelle would become a reference point in speeches and writings. Robespierre himself denounced the salt tax as one of the clearest expressions of aristocratic cruelty. For reformers and radicals alike, the Gabelle became shorthand for injustice that masqueraded as law. It was proof that the state had abused its power, and that the people had suffered in silence for too long. But even as the political winds shifted, the scars of the Gabelle remained. In the mining towns, poverty did not disappear overnight. The mines continued to operate. The coughs still echoed in the tunnels. And though the law no longer forced families to buy salt at fixed rates, the wounds of those long years did not heal quickly. Many former salt workers found themselves adrift in the changing landscape. Some hoped for new protections, new rights, new dignity in their labor. Others were swept up in the chaos of revolutionary restructuring. Some towns saw violence, not only against officials, but against neighbors suspected of having enforced the old laws too eagerly. Memory lingered, and with it, bitterness. Yet among the silence, there was also a sense of release. The salt stores that had once stood at the center of villages gray, heavy and unyielding, were now empty or repurposed. Some became meeting halls, others grain warehouses. In a few places, they were torn down altogether, stone by stone, as if to erase the past. But the people remembered. The salt had shaped them. It had rubbed their skin raw, filled their lungs with dust, and thinned their soup for decades. It had driven their fathers to smuggle, their mothers to scrape together coins, their sons to protest. And now it was over, or nearly over. The revolution did not solve all problems. In many ways, it unleashed new kinds of suffering. But it changed the vocabulary of justice. And in that new vocabulary, salt had a place, not as tribute, but as testimony. The Gabelle would briefly return under Napoleon, rebranded and restructured, but its spirit had already been broken. The people no longer feared it. They had tasted rebellion. Though it was bitter, it was also freeing. You can imagine, perhaps, an older miner sitting near the mouth of a disused shaft, long after his last descent. His hands, thick and scored with callus, rest on his knees. His gaze is distant. Around him, the village is quieter now. Children play. The bakery smells of fresh bread instead of old brine. A boy runs past with a salt shaker, laughing. The miner says nothing. He does not smile, but something in his eyes suggests that he remembers both the weight and its lifting. This, then, is the aftermath. Not triumph, exactly, but change. The salt remains in the soil, in the mines, in the air of old houses, but not in the law, not in the chain around the neck. The people have moved forward, scarred, yes, but no longer bowed, and salt, for all its quiet cruelty, helped make it so. Beneath the modern towns and tidy fields of France, deep below the reach of roads and routes, lie the remnants of lives once swallowed by stone and salt. These tunnels, some now sealed, others collapsed, and a few preserved by chance or intention, speak not with voices, but with the strange, haunting stillness of abandoned effort. They are museums without labels, archives without ink. Yet if you stand within them, more imagine yourself there. In the cold, unmoving quiet, you can hear the whisper of pickaxes, the shuffle of boots through damp grit, and the murmur of breath behind a miner's scarf. You can feel the rhythm of their world pressed into the walls. Salt, strangely, is a preservative, not just of food, but of the past. It resists decay. It absorbs and holds moisture, slows rot, stiffens cloth, and dries skin. This preserving power extends into architecture. Salt-coated timbers, while weakened over time, often remain in place centuries after being installed. Tools left behind in a moment of collapse or abandonment, wooden shovels, bent iron wedges, broken lanterns have been discovered intact, their surfaces dulled, but their shapes unmistakable. In some cases, entire corridors have been found sealed with earth and stone, forgotten by record keepers, but remembered by the ground itself. When these places are uncovered during roadworks, construction, or the curiosity of local historians, they offer a glimpse, not into the grand histories of kings and councils, but into the daily traces left by men who toiled in silence. The air in these tunnels is still heavy. You can feel it on your skin, cool, dense, and faintly metallic. It tastes faintly of mineral water and long-quenched fires. The ceilings are low, and the walls are damp. The beams that once supported them are now warped and sagging, but they stand. Their surfaces are often covered in a fine, crystalline dust, glittering faintly in the torchlight of modern explorers. But among these natural textures lie the human marks, faint, often overlooked, but quietly profound. On one wall, a series of initials scratched into the salt, simple, uneven letters, carved by a man who may not have known how to write his own name on paper, but who wanted, in that moment, to leave behind a sign, perhaps to say, "I was here," perhaps to remind himself he was still real. Elsewhere, a rough drawing of a pickaxe, nearly the length of a man's forearm, carved with care and symmetry. Was it a symbol of pride, of identity, or perhaps a warning, a signal to others? The meaning is lost. The gesture remains. Most poignant of all are the small, almost hidden carvings that appear near niches, places where candles once sat, melted down to their stubs. In one mine near the Loire Valley, a tunnel collapsed in the 18th century and was not reopened for more than 200 years. Inside, they found a tiny alcove scratched with words. Pas vu le ciel depuis 19 jours. I haven't seen the sky in 19 days. There is no name, no date, just the phrase. It is not a declaration, not a cry for help, but a quiet noting of time lost, time endured, time marked by the absence of light. This kind of graffiti, the slow, private record of lives spent underground, is not the heroic history celebrated in monuments. It is a history of survival, of repetition, of weary humor and quiet despair. It tells us what mattered to the men who lived with stone against their skin: names, days, tools, time, and above all, presence, proof they had passed through, proof they existed. Not all discoveries are so somber. In one preserved shaft in the Franche-Comté region, a section of wooden rail track was uncovered, still bearing the rusted metal straps that once held the wheels of salt carts on course. The cart itself had rotted away, but one side panel remained, etched with a child's drawing, perhaps scratched during a rare visit from a miner's son, or maybe the idle work of a younger laborer during a break. The image was simple: a smiling face, a crude sun, and a tree with uneven branches. There are no trees underground, of course, but perhaps that's why he drew one. In other places, objects tell stories all their own. A discarded clay pipe, still packed with dried tobacco. A tiny scrap of linen, once sewn into a tunic's collar. A leather shoe, hardened by salt, its heel worn entirely through. Each piece is quiet, unremarkable, perhaps, but together they form a chorus of human presence, from men who labored, rested, smoked, stitched, walked, and eventually vanished. Modern archaeologists who study these tunnels approach their work slowly. The mines are fragile. A single touch can disturb layers of salt that have clung to their form for generations. And so they work gently, brushing away grit, mapping passageways, taking samples of crystals, and photographing walls that still bear the marks of hand-hewn chisels. Sometimes they find candle stubs still in their holders, blackened and brittle. These were not candles for comfort. They were strictly practical, burning just long enough to see your hands, to avoid stepping into holes or walking into walls. But they were precious. Each miner was allotted a limited number per shift, and the light was rationed like food. In some tunnels, you can still see the black smudges on the ceiling where soot from those candles collected. Lines of charcoal that drift upward and fade. Above those stains, silence. It is tempting to imagine these places as ghostly or haunted, but they are not. There is no malevolence here, only memory. These tunnels are not tombs. They are the negative space of a forgotten economy, the underside of royal privilege, where men bent themselves into the shape of need and left behind their shadows in the salt. Every once in a while, a new tunnel is uncovered. A farmer digging a new well, a construction crew widening a road, a historian rereading old estate records that mention a lost entrance. And when the ground opens and reveals its narrow corridors, what returns is not just history, it is humility. A reminder that the wealth of the past often rested on the backs of those who never saw its rewards. That beneath the gilded edges of France's ancien grandeur, there was always a quiet, pale labor hidden in the ground. If you were to walk those tunnels, now carefully, lantern in hand, boots sinking slightly into salted earth, you would not hear the clang of tools or the barked orders of overseers. Only your own breath, perhaps a drip of water from a crack overhead, the silence of stone, of time, of memory itself. And perhaps, if you stopped at a wall, you might notice a faint carving, a name long eroded, a line drawn with care, a phrase scratched at shoulder height. You might run your fingers over it gently and feel the grooves, shallow but stubborn, like the men who made them. And in that moment, you would understand that history is not always written in books. Sometimes it is written in salt. Imagine once more descending into those deep, dark tunnels beneath the French earth, the cold dampness pressing gently against your skin, the faint, flickering glow of a single candle barely illuminating the walls, encrusted thickly with salt crystals that sparkle like frozen stars. Here, in the quiet stillness of the mine, you are not only enveloped by the mineral-rich earth, but also by a rich tapestry of belief, quiet, whispered world of superstition and ritual that gave the miners a thread of comfort in a place where darkness and danger walked hand in hand. The mine was not merely a physical space of labor and exhaustion. It was, to those who descended daily into its depths. The miners knew well that the earth was capricious. It could shift suddenly, swallowing a passageway without warning, releasing choking dust or noxious air, or extinguishing the fragile flames that were their sole guide through the labyrinth of stone and salt. It was this precarious balance that gave rise to the deeply rooted beliefs and superstitions that shaped every moment spent underground. One of the most enduring and pervasive of these was the belief in les esprits de la mine, spirits of the mine. These were understood in many ways. Some thought of them as the souls of miners who had perished in the tunnels, forever bound to the earth they had worked so hard to carve through. Others saw them as guardians or custodians of the salt itself, powerful forces that could either watch benevolently over the living or punish those who showed disrespect. To encounter these spirits was to encounter the living mine. Miners spoke of sudden drafts of cold air, inexplicable echoes, or the subtle creaking of timbers as signs of the spirit's presence. These were not voices in the traditional sense, but sensations, feelings, a sense of being watched or accompanied by something unseen. Such experiences were deeply personal and often shared only in whispers, for fear of ridicule or worse, accusations of superstition. Because the spirits were unpredictable, miners developed rituals and charms to appease them and ensure safe passage. Salt itself, ironically, was also used as a protective offering. A small pinch might be left at a junction or a niche, a quiet gift to the spirits as a token of respect and appeasement. In a way, salt, both treasure and burden, became a bridge between the human and the supernatural realms within the mine. Some miners kept amulets or charms fashioned from bones, stones, or bits of cloth, passed down from family or made in quiet moments of hope. These objects were treated with reverence, tucked safely inside pockets or under tunics, a constant reminder that luck and protection could be summoned in the smallest of talismans. The candle was central, not only as a source of light, but also as a symbol and messenger, be it the threat of collapse, a shift in the earth, or the approach of unseen hazards. Such omens were taken seriously. The sudden faltering of a candle might cause the miners to pause, whisper a prayer, or retrace their steps. The candle's dance was a language, silent but rich in meaning, woven deeply into the fabric of their work and survival. Some miners went further, practicing small rituals before entering the mine or before traversing particularly dangerous sections. Saint Barbara's image, often depicted with a tower and a chalice, was common in mining communities. Small medals or tokens bearing her likeness might be worn around the neck or carried in a pouch. Her story of imprisonment and martyrdom resonated with miners who saw parallels in their own confinement and peril beneath the earth. They asked for her protection from sudden death, lightning, and explosions dangers that loomed over their daily toil. Folklore also painted the underground world with figures and creatures of legend. Stories told of Les Loups, Blancs white wolves that prowled unseen in the tunnels, symbols of change, warning, or even fate itself. These spectral animals were rarely seen but often spoken of, their presence evoked in moments of heightened tension or uncertainty. There were also tales of small, elusive spirits or impstricksters who could lead a miner astray, causing disorientation or loss in the maze-like passages. These stories served as cautionary tales, reminders to remain vigilant and respectful of the mine's dangers, both physical and supernatural. These beliefs were not mere superstition to be dismissed, but functioned as vital psychological tools. The miners lived with constant risk, isolation, and exhaustion. In such an environment, ritual and faith provided structure and a sense of control, however limited. The shared prayers, charms, and whispered stories fostered solidarity and community, binding men together through common rites and fears. Imagine yourself now, standing in a narrow passage, the flickering candlelight casting long, wavering shadows on the salt-encrusted walls. The air is cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of mineral earth. You reach out to touch the rough wall, feeling the grit and crystalline texture beneath your fingertips. Nearby, a small cross is etched into the wooden beam overhead, its edges worn smooth by time and touch. Beneath it lies a tiny pile of salt crystals, a humble offering to unseen guardians. A faint charcoal drawing of a circle surrounds it, marking a sacred space amid the stone. Above you, the soot-blackened ceiling bears the streaks of many candle flames, each a tiny record of hope and vigilance. marking the passage of countless shifts and the fragile boundary between safety and disaster. In this dim world, the ordinary becomes profound. Every small gesture, sprinkling salt, crossing oneself, lighting a candle, speaks of the human desire to find meaning and protection in a place that offers little comfort. These customs persisted quietly, passed from miner to miner, father to son, generation to generation. They softened the harshness of the underground, weaving a fabric of belief and ritual that held strong against the relentless grind of labor. And while the great halls of Versailles glistened above with gilded splendor, far below, in the cold salt mines, these whispered beliefs and candlelit omens were the daily comforts of men who lived and worked in the margins of light and shadow, far from the dank tunnels, the flickering candles, and the slow coughs echoing underground. The salt of France took on another form, transformed not by labor but by leisure, not by sweat but by spectacle. At the Palace of Versailles, where courtiers moved through polished halls under gilded ceilings and chandeliers burned through the night, salt still held its place, but here it arrived not in heavy burlap sacks or creaking carts. It arrived in crystal, silver, and gold. To understand the chasm between the world of the miners and the nobility, it is enough to observe the table of a single aristocratic meal. Picture a dining room at Versailles, sunlight filtering through tall windows, softened by silk drapes. The floors gleam, buffed by silent attendants, and the air carries a faint perfume, orange blossom, perhaps, or violet water. The meal is a long affair, taken in courses. Dozens, sometimes plates, are removed, replaced, wiped, and warmed. Conversation murmurs, interspersed with laughter and the clink of silver. At the center of the table sits a small but dazzling object, the salt cellar. Salt, at Versailles, was not only a seasoning, it was a symbol, a mark of refinement, of taste, of elevated life. The salt cellar, often made of cut glass, porcelain, or even solid gold, reflected that significance. Its design might feature tiny, sculpted figures, goddesses, satyrs, lions, or be shaped like a shell, a boat, or a miniature pavilion. It was an object not only for utility, but for admiration. The salt itself was not coarse or gray. It was white, dry, carefully ground, sometimes perfumed with lavender or herbs. It might be passed with a special spoon, no larger than a thumbnail, carved from ivory or cast in silver. In certain settings, each diner had their own salt spoon, lest fingers touch the shared treasure. Other cellars were communal, but watched carefully. To spill salt was a faux pas. To ask for it was rare, unless offered. Even the way salt was used at Versailles spoke volumes. It was never rubbed onto the skin of preserved meats, or used to draw blood from fish, as it was in peasant kitchens. It was sprinkled lightly into a roasted pheasant, a sauce of veal and capers, or the rind of a fresh fig. It was a final touch, like a gemstone, placed atop an already ornate crown. And yet, this refined use masked the deeper truth. The salt on those golden spoons had traveled the same path, extracted from the same mines, hauled by men in the dark, scraped from stone and taxed at the source. There is a deep, quiet irony in that journey from crusted boots and cracked hands to gloved fingers and silk sleeves. The substance remained the same. The contexts could not have been more different. To live at Versailles was to dwell in the abstraction of luxury. The palace was not built for practicality. It was built to dazzle, to distance, and to display. Everything had meaning. A chair's curve, a mirror's edge, a flower's placement, and salt, humble as it was, had its place in that pageantry. For those who served in the kitchens, salt was controlled with careful precision. The royal household maintained inventories of every grain that entered and left its storerooms. Special clerks noted the varieties coarse, refined, smoke-tanned, their quantities. Cooks used it sparingly, but artfully, following recipes that were themselves performances of status and knowledge. There were also rules of etiquette surrounding salt at the table. To offer it was a gesture of civility. To withhold it, a quiet insult. To spill it, a cause for embarrassment. One was never to reach across the table for the salt cellar. Instead, it was passed with ceremony, always right hand to right hand. Superstition, even here, lingered gently beneath the surface echoes of older beliefs cloaked in etiquette. Versailles was a place of surfaces, gleaming, curated, controlled, and in that environment, salt was another layer of ornamentation, a punctuation on the performance of aristocracy. But unlike ribbons or jewels, salt carried the faint, invisible weight of labor. It was a thing touched by toil, though no one at court needed to think about that. The chain between the mine and the manor was long enough and quiet enough to be forgotten. Yet, even in the glittering halls, traces of the world beneath remained. Consider the linens. At fine dinners, after each course, guests were offered perfumed hand towels, small squares of linen, lightly soaked in rosewater, sometimes laced with lemon or rosemary. These towels were passed on silver trays, and guests would dab their fingers gently, removing any trace of food. Before the towel, however, came a small pinch of salt, pressed lightly onto the fingertips. A ritual touch, believed by some to cleanse and purify. Others claimed it heightened the palate, preparing the tongue for the next bite. The truth likely mattered less than the gesture. It was salt made civil transformed into elegance. In the guest rooms, salt occasionally appeared as a scent. Bowls of coarse crystals mixed with dried herbs, placed on windowsills to sweeten the air and suggest refinement. In the bathhouses of the wealthy, salt was stirred into steaming water to soften the skin. Apothecaries sold salt-based remedies, rinses, ointments, claiming everything from pain relief to spiritual cleansing. At Versailles, salt was everywhere and nowhere at once. And in that quiet omnipresence lies the key to understanding its place in elite society. It was so foundational as to be invisible, taken for granted, as natural and unquestioned as the sunlight that poured through gold-rimmed windows. And in that that distance lay the final insult to those who labored underground. They had touched this salt with bleeding fingers, carried it across their backs, and watched their families go hungry under the weight of the tax. And yet, in the royal halls, salt was offered with a smile, received with a nod, and forgotten with the scrape of a gilded fork against porcelain. The great divide between the miners and the monarchy was not merely one of wealth or work, it was one of awareness. At the bottom, salt was pain. At the top, salt was seasoning. And so, the substance that joined the kingdom across regions, across classes, across centuries, was also the clearest marker of its separations. Salt was what you mined, what you smuggled, what you paid for, what you feared. Or it was what you passed, what you admired, what you barely noticed. Imagine now a quiet chamber at Versailles, the candlelight warm, the room silent. A table sits prepared for a midnight meal. A single salt cellar rests at its center, delicate, glittering, unnecessary. The servant who placed it does not think of mines. The guest who uses it does not think of hunger. But the salt remembers. Imagine the map of 18th century France not as a single unified country, but as a patchwork of privileges, customs, and contradictions. At the center stands the throne, gleaming, gilded, and far removed from the mud-caked boots of farmers or the salt-streaked hands of miners. And stretched outward from that glittering center are the provinces, each with its own rules, each touched by the same monarchy, but not always in the same way. Across this landscape, the Gabelle salt taxed did not fall evenly. Instead, it fell with a strange and quiet cruelty, calibrated not by fairness, but by convenience and control. At the heart of it all sat the king, Louis XIV, then Louis XV, then the doomed Louis XVI, each inheriting a tax system so complex, so embedded in tradition, and so tangled in contradiction that reform seemed almost impossible. The gabelle was among the most hated of all levies, not simply because it demanded money, but because it demanded it unfairly. Some regions were burdened heavily, others lightly. Some people paid dearly, others not at all. And the differences were not accidental, they were carefully preserved. To understand the resentment this created, you must picture life not in the court, but in the province, especially in what were called the Passes de Grandon Gabelle, the regions where the salt tax was heaviest. In places like Berry and Anjou, the government dictated exactly how much salt a household must purchase each year, regardless of need. This obligatory salt had to be bought by every person above the age of 8. There were quotas to meet, prices fixed far above market rates, and punishments for non-compliance. In these regions, salt was not merely expensive, it was oppressive. The law made it illegal to use unlicensed salt for preserving food, for curing meat, for treating wounds. All such acts were considered forms of tax evasion. Even boiling seawater on the coast could land a person in jail. The tax inspectors, or gabellists, were given wide powers. They could enter homes without warning. They could search luggage, storage rooms, or even clothing. Smuggling salt was treated as a serious crime, and entire families could be punished for it. But elsewhere in the Pays, such as Brittany or parts of Burgundy, the story was different. There, people paid little or nothing. Salt flowed freely. Families could buy as much or as little as they wanted at market prices. There were no quotas, no forced purchases, no sudden inspections. These disparities were not a secret. They were deeply resented. Travelers could move just a few miles and find themselves in a different legal world, where neighbors had freedoms they lacked. A farmer in Anjou might strain to afford his monthly salt quota, while his cousin in Brittany preserved fish in barrels of unregulated salt. A cook-in might be fined for seasoning meat with untaxed crystals, while a merchant in Dijon did so without a second thought. Over time, this patchwork system sowed more than frustration. It fostered bitterness, envy, and an enduring sense of injustice. The salt smugglers, the fauxonniers, became folk heroes in some areas, symbols of resistance against a system that taxed necessity. Entire communities helped hide them, warn them, and protect them from arrest. In some towns, their names were whispered with admiration, and their disappearances mourned like those of soldiers. And behind all this inequity stood the crown. King Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, had strengthened the tax system as part of his vision of absolute monarchy. The gabelle brought in revenue not only for war and court extravagance, but also to pay off debts and fund local bureaucracy. The salt tax was farmed outsold as a right to tax collectors, who paid the crown up front and made their profits by extracting as much as possible. These fermiers generaux became immensely wealthy and deeply unpopular. They had little accountability and few restrictions. As long as the king's coffers were full, the people's complaints were largely ignored. Louis XV inherited this apparatus and continued to rely on it, even as criticism mounted. The Enlightenment was beginning to stir in salons and pamphlets, and thinkers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu began to question the moral legitimacy of such inequality. But the king, more interested in personal pleasures and court life, was slow to act. Reform was discussed, then abandoned. Each year, more salt flowed from the earth, and more coins from the hands of the poor. When Louis XVI ascended to the throne in 1774, there was some hope of change. The new king was thoughtful, earnest, and interested in reform. He appointed financial advisors who recommended ending the Gabelle. The system, they argued, was outdated, inefficient, and cruel. It divided the kingdom and undermined the very authority of the crown it was meant to serve. But reform was not simple. The Gabelle accounted for over 6% of France's income. Removing it meant finding new sources of revenue or drastically cutting expenses. The nobles resisted, the clergy protested, the tax farmers lobbied, and Louis, cautious and indecisive, hesitated. Instead of sweeping reform, he approved modest changes. Some of the worst abuses were curbed. Quotas were adjusted, penalties softened. But the system remained intact, and the resentment continued to simmer. The people of France were growing tired of promises. They were weary of small adjustments. In town squares, markets, and churches, they spoke in low tones of change, not just of tax relief, but of transformation. When the Estates General was called in 1789, the Gabelle appeared in cahiers de grievance lists compiled by communities across the country. Town after town demanded its abolition. It was no longer simply a tax. It was a symbol of privilege, of injustice, of a monarchy that asked everything and gave nothing. By the summer of that year, the revolution had begun. The Bastille fell, the National Assembly rose, and in the midst of sweeping declarations and the drafting of a new constitution, the Gabelle was finally suspended. For some, it was a quiet victory. For others, a beginning. The salt tax, so small, so ordinary, had helped light the fuse. But even as the system collapsed, the memory remained. In the provinces that had suffered most, there was little forgiveness. The crown had overseen decades of unfair taxation. It had enforced its will with jails, soldiers, and threats. And though the king now claimed reform, it came too late. The fury was not loud. It was not shouted in the salons of Paris or the chambers of Versailles. It was quiet, steady, provincial, a fury that had grown not from theory, but from daily life, from saltless soup, from empty purses, from the footsteps of Gabelle at the door. This was the fury that would eventually strip Louis XVI of his crown, his home, and his life, not born from ambition, but from endurance. Imagine now a narrow village road, the salt depot long shuttered, the taxman's house empty. Children play in the dust, drawing lines with sticks, and the old men sit on the benches, hats low, saying little. But they remember. They remember the weight of obligation, the taste of bitterness, the noise of injustice that had, for so long, worn the face of silence. And so, salt white dry and ordinary became one of the revolution's quietest accomplices. Not through fire, but through friction. Through years of being ground against the poor, until the poor could no longer bear it. Now that we've reached the end of our journey through damp tunnels and gilded chambers, through whispered prayers and angry silence, let us gently rise, slowly, from the depths where the walls glisten with ancient labor and return, without hurry, to the world above. Salt is such a small thing, a grain, a pinch, a gesture at the table, easy to forget, easy to take for granted. And yet, throughout history, it has moved empires and broken backs. It has passed from hand to hand, changing its meaning along the way from burden to luxury, from punishment to seasoning. We began in the dark. We stood with the miner before dawn, his hands blistered, his breath white in the cold air of the shaft. We walked with him into the tunnels, the candlelight trembling against salt-streaked beams. We felt the ache in his shoulders, the sting in his lungs, and the strange comfort of whispered beliefs passed down through generations. And when he scratched a mark into the wall or left a pinch of salt by the path, we understood what it meant. Not superstition, but presence, proof of being. Then we rose through time, through the riots sparked by hunger and tax, the cries of a people weary of paying too much for too little. We watched as salt, once enforced by law, became the unspoken reason for revolution. Not the cause, perhaps, but a quiet symbol, steady, grinding reminder that the world was built unevenly. And finally, we walked the polished floors of Versailles. We paused by the salt cellars carved like tiny temples and watched the powdered fingers of nobles reach for gold-rimmed spoons. They lived in a different world, those few, one glazed in ceremony and forgetting. But the salt they touched still remembered. History, like salt, settles into the crevices. It lingers in the quiet places, in worn shoes, in soot-blackened ceilings, in words scratched by candlelight. And even when the stories go untold, the shapes of those lives remain, waiting in the stillness.